It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1978 when Harold Jensen stood in the gravel driveway of his 200-acre farm outside of Ames, Iowa, watching a gleaming green and yellow John Deere 4040 pull up on a flatbed trailer. His son, Michael, 26 years old and fresh from an agriculture business degree at Iowa State, stood beside him with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. The tractor was beautiful, no doubt about it. Four-wheel drive, turbocharged diesel engine, enclosed cab with air conditioning and a stereo system. It was the kind of machine that made neighbors stop their trucks on the county road just to stare. But Harold's face told a different story. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrow, and before the delivery driver could even lower the ramps, Harold raised his hand and said 5 words that would echo through that family for the next 40 years. "Turn it around. Take it back." Michael's smile vanished. The driver looked confused, and in that moment a lesson was being taught that had nothing to do with horsepower or hydraulics, and everything to do with survival. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what was happening across the American farm belt in the late 1970s. It was a time of unprecedented optimism, a golden age that farmers believed would last forever. The numbers seemed to prove it. Corn prices had shot up from $1.10 a bushel in 1972 to over $3 by 1974. Wheat went even higher. The Soviet Union had entered the grain market in a massive way after a series of bad harvests, and American farmers were feeding the world. Land values were exploding. In Iowa, farmland that sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was going for $2,000 by 1978, and some parcels were hitting $3,000. Banks were practically begging farmers to borrow money. The government was encouraging expansion. Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz had famously told farmers to plant fence row to fence row, to get big or get out, and the farmers listened. They bought more land, bigger equipment, more inputs. They leveraged everything they had to capture what seemed like an endless wave of prosperity. Michael Jensen was a product of this optimism. He had grown up on his father's farm, but he had also spent 4 years studying modern agricultural business practices. His professors had taught him about economies of scale, about how larger operations with newer equipment could dramatically reduce per-unit costs. They had shown him charts and graphs proving that farmers who invested in the latest technology would outcompete those who clung to older methods. When Michael graduated in May of 1977, he came home with a business plan. He wanted to expand the farm from 200 acres to 500. He wanted to buy 3 adjacent parcels that were coming up for sale. And he wanted to upgrade their equipment entirely. The centerpiece of this plan was that John Deere 4040, a tractor that cost $42,000, more than twice what Harold had paid for his entire 160 acres back in 1952. Harold had listened to his son's presentation at the kitchen table that summer. He had looked at the spreadsheets, the projections, the loan documents Michael had already started filling out. The numbers did look good, at least on paper. With corn at $2.70 a bushel and land appreciating at 20% a year, the debt would pay itself off in 7 years, maybe less. The bank had already pre-approved them for a $300,000 operating loan. Michael's voice had been confident, almost impatient. "Dad, everyone's doing this. The Hendersons just bought 800 acres. The Paulson brothers ordered 2 of these tractors. If we don't expand now, we're going to get left behind." Harold had nodded slowly, asking questions here and there, but mostly staying quiet. He had built this farm from almost nothing. He had started with 40 acres that he rented in 1947, saved every penny from his work at the implement dealership in town, and bought his first land in 1952. He had expanded slowly, acre by acre, never borrowing more than he could pay back in 2 good years. By 1978, the farm was paid off entirely. No mortgage, no equipment loans, nothing. Harold owned it free and clear, and that gave him something that most of his neighbors didn't have anymore. It gave him the ability to say no. But Michael was his only son, and Harold wanted to give him a chance. So he had agreed to think about it. He had agreed to let Michael order the tractor to start the process, but he had also told his son something that Michael didn't fully understand at the time. "We'll see what the price of corn does this fall. If it holds, we'll talk. If it drops, we're not doing any of this." Michael had taken that as a yes. He had ordered the tractor in September, put down a $5,000 deposit, and told everyone in town that the Jensens were about to become one of the major operations in the county. He had already started negotiating for the adjacent land, but Harold had been watching something that his son wasn't paying attention to. He had been watching interest rates. In 1977, the prime lending rate was 6.5%. By early 1978, it was 7.5%. By that March morning when the tractor arrived, it was pushing 9%. The Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, was getting serious about fighting inflation, and that meant raising rates aggressively. Harold had lived through enough economic cycles to know what rising rates meant for farmers. It meant the cost of carrying debt was going up. It meant the money that speculators were pouring into farmland might start looking for safer returns. It meant that the commodity boom that had driven grain prices up could reverse just as quickly as it had started. And most importantly, it meant that farmers who had leveraged themselves to the hilt were going to be in serious trouble if crop prices fell even a little bit. Michael hadn't wanted to hear any of this. In his mind, his father was being old-fashioned, too cautious, stuck in a Depression-era mentality that no longer applied. The world had changed. Agriculture was a modern business now, not a subsistence lifestyle. You had to invest to compete. But Harold wasn't interested in competing with the Hendersons or the Paulson brothers. He was interested in surviving. And when that tractor showed up in March, 6 months after Michael had ordered it, Harold had already made his decision. Corn prices had dropped to $2.40 a bushel. Interest rates were still climbing. And the 3 parcels of land Michael wanted to buy had just been listed at $4,500 an acre, 50% higher than comparable sales just a year earlier. The math didn't work anymore, if it ever really had, so Harold sent the tractor back. The argument that followed was one of the worst fights that family had ever had. Michael accused his father of sabotaging his future, of being too afraid to take any risk, of condemning the farm to irrelevance. Harold didn't raise his voice. He just asked his son one question. Can you guarantee that corn will stay above $2 for the next 10 years? Michael couldn't, of course. No one could. But he insisted that all the experts said the demand was there, that global population was growing, that American agriculture was entering a permanent new era of profitability. Harold had heard that kind of talk before. He had heard it in the 1920s, right before the crash that had destroyed his own father's farm. He had heard it in the early 1950s, before the commodity surplus that had driven prices down for a decade. He knew that in farming, nothing was permanent except the land itself, and only if you could hold on to it. For the next 3 years, Michael stayed on the farm, but the tension never fully went away. He worked hard, he did his part, but he watched with frustration as other farms in the county expanded while the Jensens stayed the same size. He watched the Hendersons buy a brand new combine that could harvest twice as fast as theirs. He watched the Paulson brothers add 400 acres and build a massive grain storage facility. He listened to them talk at the co-op about their gross revenues, their production numbers, their plans to keep growing. And he wondered if his father had been wrong. Maybe this time really was different. Maybe the old rules didn't apply anymore. Then came 1981. The bottom fell out. Interest rates hit 20%. The Federal Reserve's fight against inflation had become a war, and farmers were the casualties. Corn prices collapsed to $2.20, then $2, then $1.80. The export boom that everyone had counted on evaporated as the strong dollar made American grain uncompetitive overseas. Land values started to drop. At first it was gradual, just a softening of the market. But by 1983, it was a free fall. Iowa farmland that had sold for $4,000 an acre in 1979 was going for $1,500, then $1,200, then less. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand suddenly found themselves underwater. Their debt exceeded the value of their land and equipment. The banks that had been so eager to lend just a few years earlier were now demanding payment, calling in loans, foreclosing on properties. It was the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression. The Hendersons lost their farm in 1983. They had borrowed $350,000 to finance their expansion, and when land values collapsed, the bank refused to refinance. They held an auction in November of that year. Harold and Michael drove over to watch. The equipment sold for pennies on the dollar. The land went for half of what the Hendersons had paid for it. The family moved to Des Moines, where Mr. Henderson got a job at a construction company. He never farmed again. The Paulson brothers managed to hold on a little longer, but by 1985, they were gone too. They had over $700,000 in debt, most of it at variable interest rates that had doubled their payments. They tried to restructure, tried to sell off parcels, but there were no buyers. The farm that had been in their family for 4 generations went to the bank. Across Iowa, across the entire Midwest, the same story played out thousands of times. Equipment dealerships closed. Small-town banks failed. Main streets emptied out. It was a disaster, and it was entirely predictable to anyone who understood that debt magnifies everything, both gains and losses. The Jensen farm survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived in a way that would have been impossible if they had followed Michael's plan. Because they had no debt, they could operate profitably even with corn at $1.80 a bushel. It wasn't comfortable, and there were years when they barely broke even, but they never missed a payment because they didn't have any payments to make. And when the foreclosures started, when all that land came back on the market at distressed prices, Harold had something that almost no one else had. He had cash. Not a lot, but enough. In 1984, he bought 80 acres from a neighbor's estate sale for $800 an acre. In 1986, he bought another 120 acres for even less. He paid cash for both parcels. No loans, no leverage, no risk. By the time the farm crisis ended in the late 80s, the Jensen operation had nearly doubled in size, and they still didn't owe a dollar to anyone. Michael learned the lesson, though it took him years to fully appreciate it. He learned that his father's caution wasn't fear or ignorance. It was wisdom born from understanding cycles, from recognizing that the most dangerous time to borrow money is when everyone tells you it's safe. He learned that in agriculture, as in any business tied to commodity prices, the winners aren't necessarily the ones who grow the fastest. They're the ones who survive the downturns with enough resources left to capitalize on the opportunities that those downturns create. By the early 90s, when Michael took over daily management of the farm, he operated with the same philosophy his father had: conservative leverage, slow expansion, always keeping enough cushion to weather a bad stretch. When he eventually did buy that John Deere tractor, it was in 1993, and he paid cash for it. It was used, 3 years old, and it cost him $18,000. It served them well for 15 years. The story of that returned tractor became something of a legend in the family. Michael's own children heard about it, and when his daughter went to study agricultural economics at Iowa State in the 2000s, she used it as the basis for a case study on farm debt and financial management. She interviewed her grandfather, who was in his 80s by then, and asked him how he had known to be so cautious when everyone else was optimistic. Harold's answer was simple. I didn't know anything for certain, but I knew what I could control and what I couldn't. I could control whether we had debt. I couldn't control corn prices or interest rates or what the Soviets were going to buy. So I controlled what I could. It was a farmer's version of ancient wisdom, the kind that gets forgotten in good times and remembered too late in bad ones. The broader lesson extends far beyond farming. What happened in the Farm Belt in the late 70s and early 80s was a case study in how credit cycles create boom and bust patterns that devastate those who don't understand them. Easy credit and rising asset prices create a self-reinforcing cycle. People borrow to buy assets, which drives prices higher, which makes it easier to borrow more, which drives prices even higher. Everyone looks smart, everyone feels rich, and anyone who suggests caution is dismissed as out of touch. But the cycle always reverses. When it does, the leverage that amplified gains on the way up amplifies losses on the way down. Asset prices fall, debt remains constant, and suddenly people owe more than their assets are worth. They're forced to sell, which drives prices down further, which forces more selling. It's a cascade, and it destroys more wealth, more livelihoods, more families than most people can imagine until they've lived through it. The farm crisis wasn't unique. It followed the same pattern as countless other credit booms throughout history: the railroad expansion of the 1880s, the Florida land boom of the 1920s, the commercial real estate bubble of the late 80s, the dot-com era of the late 90s, the housing bubble of the 2000s. Each time the specifics are different, but the dynamics are the same. Easy money, Rising prices, growing confidence that this time is different, then a reversal that catches the leveraged players completely unprepared. And each time, the people who survive best are those who resist the temptation to maximize their upside by taking on debt they can't service in a downturn. Harold Jensen understood something that many people never learn. He understood that the goal isn't to make the most money possible in good times. The goal is to stay in the game long enough to benefit from the opportunities that bad times create. Wealth, real lasting wealth, isn't built by riding the boom. It's built by surviving the bust and being ready to act when assets are cheap and everyone else is desperate. The farmers who got rich in the 80s weren't the ones who expanded aggressively in the 70s. They were the ones who stayed conservative, kept their powder dry, and bought land at bankruptcy prices when everyone else was underwater. Harold was one of those farmers. He didn't plan it that way exactly. He wasn't trying to time the market or make a fortune off his neighbor's misery. He was just trying to keep his farm, to make sure that his family's land would still be there for the next generation. But the result was the same. By avoiding debt when everyone else was gorging on it, he positioned himself to thrive when the inevitable reversal came. There's a deeper question embedded in this story, one that goes beyond economics and touches on human nature itself. Why do people find it so hard to resist the crowd? Why is it so difficult to be conservative when everyone else is being aggressive? Part of it is fear of missing out. When your neighbors are buying new equipment and expanding their operations and talking about their success, it's painful to stand still. You feel like you're being left behind, like you're making a mistake. But there's something else too, something more fundamental. In boom times, caution looks like cowardice. The conservative person, the one who says no to easy credit and rising prices, appears to be irrational. The evidence seems to be against them. Prices are going up. Loans are easy to service. Everyone who borrowed money is making a profit. The person urging caution has no proof that things will change. They can only point to history, to cycles, to principles that seem abstract and outdated in the face of current reality. And so they're dismissed, mocked sometimes, treated as relics who don't understand the new paradigm. But cycles always turn. The new paradigm always reveals itself to be the same old pattern in different clothes. And when the turn comes, the conservative person is suddenly the only rational one in the room. The problem is that by then, it's too late for most people to change course. They're already committed, already leveraged, already trapped. The lesson, if there is one, is that the time to be conservative is precisely when it looks most foolish. The time to avoid debt is when credit is easy and everyone tells you it's smart to borrow. The time to be cautious is when caution seems unnecessary. This is counterintuitive, which is why so few people do it. But it's also why those who do end up owning the assets when the cycle completes. Harold Jensen died in 2009 at the age of 86. The farm that he had built, that he had protected through multiple economic cycles, that he had expanded slowly and carefully over 60 years, was worth nearly $8 million by then. It was still in the family, still debt-free, still operating profitably. Michael ran it with his daughter, who had come back after getting her degree and working in agricultural finance for a few years. She had seen the credit cycle play out again in different industries, and she had come to appreciate her grandfather's approach in a way that only experience can teach. When Michael eventually retired and handed the operation over to her, he gave her the same advice his father had given him. Control what you can control. Don't bet the farm on things you can't. The John Deere 4040 that Harold sent back in 1978 would have been one of those things he couldn't control. The tractor itself was fine, probably would have lasted 20 years with proper maintenance. But the debt that came with it, the expansion it represented, the commitment to a future that assumed stable or rising prices and low interest rates, that was the bet. And it was a bet that would have destroyed them. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, over the early 80s, as the interest payments mounted and the crop prices fell and the land value collapsed. They would have joined the Hendersons and the Paulsons and thousands of other families who lost everything. Instead, they survived. They did more than survive. They prospered in a way that would have been impossible if they had followed the crowd. There's no moral superiority in this story. Harold wasn't smarter than his neighbors, and he wasn't braver. He was just more afraid of the downside than he was excited about the upside. He had lived through his father losing everything in the Depression and he had promised himself that he would never let that happen to his own family. That fear, that memory, gave him the strength to stand alone when everyone else was running the other direction. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't popular. Michael resented him for years, but it was right. Not morally right, just correct in the sense that it aligned with how the world actually works, rather than how people wished it worked in the moment. Think about your own life, your own decisions, your own vulnerabilities to credit cycles and crowd behavior. How much of what you own do you actually own, and how much does the bank own? When the next recession comes, and it will come because they always do, will you be in a position to weather it, or will you be one of the ones who gets washed away because you borrowed too much when money was cheap and confidence was high? These aren't comfortable questions. They're not fun to think about, but they're necessary, because the only way to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past is to understand the patterns that drive them. The farmers of the late 70s didn't think they were making mistakes. They thought they were being smart, modern, business savvy. They had degrees and spreadsheets and expert advice. But they didn't have the one thing that mattered most. They didn't have the discipline to resist the temptation to maximize their short-term gains by taking on risks that could destroy them in the long term. The tractor that never made it onto the Jensen farm sits somewhere in all of this as a symbol. It represents a choice, a fork in the road, a moment when discipline overrode ambition and caution overruled optimism. It represents the difference between what looks smart in the moment and what proves smart over time. It represents the price of independence and the value of owning something free and clear, without conditions, without obligations, without the ticking clock of compound interest working against you every single day. Most people never have a moment like that, a clear decision point where the consequences are obvious in hindsight but obscure in the moment. Most people drift into debt gradually, telling themselves it's manageable, it's normal, everyone does it. And maybe it is manageable most of the time, until it isn't. What would you have done if you were Michael Jensen, 26 years old, full of ideas and energy and modern business education, watching your father send back the tractor you had ordered? Would you have seen the wisdom in his caution, or would you have seen only the missed opportunity? Would you have trusted his experience, or would you have believed your own projections? Would you have had the patience to build slowly, or would you have wanted to capture everything you could while the moment lasted? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that define financial outcomes across generations. The answers determine who builds lasting wealth and who loses everything in the next downturn. The answers separate the families who thrive for 100 years from the families who disappear in a single crisis. And the answers are almost never clear in real time. They only become clear later, when the cycle has turned and the consequences have played out, and the leveraged players have discovered that debt magnifies everything, in both directions, always.